Today we're diving into a story that starts in a simple teacup but ends with a global drug trade that built one empire and brought another to its knees. We're going to connect the dots between Britain's absolute obsession with tea and the opium that paid for it all. It all started pretty small. Back in the 17th century, tea was this exotic, weird novelty, really a luxury for the super wealthy. But from these, pretty humble beginnings, a national obsession would grow, and one that would literally change the world. Because that novelty, it didn't stand novelty for long. It exploded into a national obsession. By the early 1800s, Britain was drinking tea on a truly industrial scale. And this created a huge economic problem. How do you pay for all of it when the country you're buying from only wants one specific thing in return? And here's where the trouble starts. Britain's appetite for Chinese goods was just ravenous. But, well, the feeling wasn't mutual, not even close. And that created a really dangerous imbalance in trade. So, you have the British showing up with all the products of their industrial revolution. Wool, cloth, all sorts of metals. But the thing is, the Chinese empire was incredibly self-sufficient. They really didn't need or want any of it. They were more than happy to sell their tea, their silk, their porcelain, but they didn't want British goods in return. They wanted silver. And they paid for it with mountains and mountains of silver. I mean, just look at that number. That's the value of pure silver leaving Britain on just a handful of ships, completely dwarfing the value of goods they were trading. This wasn't just a trade deficit, it was an economic hemorrhage, something the empire simply could not sustain. And I mean, this wasn't just some bad accounting or a rounding error on a balance sheet. It was a serious threat to the entire economic stability of the British Empire. The nation's actual wealth was literally being packed into chests and shipped overseas, pound by pound, all to pay for tea. Eventually, this whole thing reached a breaking point in the late 1700s. When Spain jumped into the American War of Independence, it completely cut off Britain's main supply of Spanish silver dollars, which was the go-to currency for the China trade. Something had to give. They desperately needed a new product, a new way to pay. And the solution they landed on was, well, it was as simple as it was devastating. A product they could grow from next to nothing in their Indian colonies: opium. The thinking was pretty ruthless, really. The British realized that if China wasn't interested in their industrial goods, maybe they could be forced to develop a taste for something else. And the commodity they chose, grown in British India, wouldn't just reverse the flow of silver. It would do so by creating millions of addicts. And this is what they created, the new engine of the British Empire, a brilliant but absolutely vicious triangle of trade. Here's how it worked. British textiles go to India. Indian opium goes to China. And then Chinese tea, all paid for with opium profits, goes to Britain. That silver drain, it wasn't just plugged, it was completely reversed. Now, silver was pouring out of China. Let's just pause for a second and absorb the sheer scale of this operation, because it's just mind-boggling. By 1837, the export value of Indian opium was staggering. Get this. It was more valuable than all the wine exported from France, Spain, and Italy combined. This wasn't some side hustle. This became the central pillar of Britain's entire commercial strategy in the East. Now, you might be wondering if the British were the only ones in on this kind of state-sponsored drug trade. And the answer is no, but their model was uniquely aggressive. See, the Dutch used a licensed farm system to sell opium inside their own colonies. What the British were doing was on another level entirely. Direct, massive smuggling into a sovereign nation, all backed up by the threat of war. So let's call this what it was. This was not legitimate commerce. It was a highly organized, state-sponsored smuggling operation, run on an industrial scale, and it was designed to bypass Chinese law and authority at every single turn. And the process itself was ruthlessly efficient. First, the East India Company had a complete monopoly on growing poppies in India. Then the processed opium was loaded onto these fast, heavily armed ships called clippers and sailed to floating warehouses anchored just outside of Chinese legal waters. From there, it was smuggled into the mainland with a whole network of bribed local officials making sure it got through. So how on earth did they justify this? Well, the official argument basically went like this. They claimed they weren't creating addiction, they were simply fulfilling an existing, necessary demand. The reasoning was, hey, if we don't supply the opium, someone else will. It was a business decision, framed as some kind of market inevitability. And the profits? My gosh, the profits were staggering. The revenue from opium exports didn't just grow, it absolutely exploded. We're talking more than a tenfold increase in just 60 years. This trade wasn't just balancing the books for tea anymore, it was generating immense new wealth for the entire empire. And this income wasn't just pocket money. It became the actual financial bedrock of the British Empire in Asia. Opium profits paid for the colonial administration, for the military, for roads, for railways. It was the fuel for the entire imperial machine. So think about that. Britain's tea habit was now being paid for by a drug trade that financed the very empire that was drinking the tea. But of course, China was not going to accept this fate passively. Seeing the absolutely devastating social and economic damage from mass addiction, the Qing government decided to finally fight back, and that decision would lead directly to war. And this wasn't some new development. The Chinese government had been trying to stop the opium trade for over a century, issuing bans and proclamations. But it all culminated in 1839 with a man named Commissioner Lin Zexu. He took drastic action, arresting thousands of dealers and, most famously, seizing and destroying a massive stockpile of British opium. He drew a line in the sand. And he didn't just use force, he also tried a moral appeal, writing this incredible letter directly to Queen Victoria herself. In it, he pointed out the blatant hypocrisy of Britain pushing a drug on his country that was strictly forbidden back in their own, and he asked her a very simple, direct question. Where is your conscience? That appeal to conscience? It failed. Completely. Britain's response to the destruction of its property, its opium, was swift military force. The wars that followed, known as the Opium Wars, were fought for one explicit reason: to force China to keep accepting the drug trade. The result was a humiliating defeat for China, the forced legalization of opium, and the loss of territory, including the island of Hong Kong. So, when you look back at all of this, it forces you to completely rethink the narrative. What we often hear framed as China's opium problem was in reality a solution to Britain's tea problem. It was a brutal economic policy that left a devastating legacy of addiction, war, and a seismic shift in global power. Which leaves us with one final provocative thought. Whose problem was it really?